Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about this unit. So last unit we talked a lot about sectionalism in the 1800s and how America's tension over the concept of slavery and especially the expansion of slavery had just reached a fever pitch. We'd already had some violence taking place in the United States. This unit, we're going to talk about the Civil War, which is a direct result from sectional tensions that had taken place for quite a while, basically since the founding of the United States as a country. Cool stuff to talk about. Let's go ahead and jump into it. America's going to have a civil war. This unit focuses very heavily on the Civil War, what happened in the Civil War, how it changed America. And then at the end of this unit, we're going to talk about Reconstruction, how when the Civil War ended, how America kind of grew to appear more like the country we have today. It's a long process. This is one of the big reasons we learn about American history, is how America evolves over time. There's no quicker and more drastic evolution of America than during the Civil War. So let's talk about this. All right. So I'd use the word secession or secede or the South left at the very end of last unit. So let's pick up from there because it's a fantastic story. So the South, if you remember, was furious in 1860 that a president could get elected that literally nobody in the South voted for. All right, so a little refresher here. 1860, the guy here on the far left, all right, that is Abraham Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln might look a little weird. He doesn't have a beard in that picture. He actually didn't have a beard until he became president. And one of the reasons he grows a beard, that famous beard that he has, is because a little girl went and saw him give a speech. And she's like, oh, I really like listening to you. She wrote him a letter later. And they found this later. This letter later. And she said, oh, I really like listening to you, but you're really ugly. If you could grow a beard, it would help people look at you when you talk. Like, this is a 10-year-old girl. She didn't... Yes, that's a vicious comment, but she's being honest. And Abraham Lincoln actually never mentioned this letter to anybody, and he just grew a beard. So nobody thought to ask him why did he randomly grow a beard, once he became president. And then after he passed away and everybody's going through all his letters and everything, they find his letter and realize he grew a beard directly after reading that letter. So that's why he doesn't have a beard in this picture. Anyway, the other three dudes here, Stephen Douglas, John Breckinridge, and John Bell, these guys are all Democrats. They all desperately don't want Lincoln to be the president, all right? The reason they don't want Lincoln to be the president is Lincoln, as a Republican, which is a new political party, is adamantly against the expansion of slavery. So when Abraham Lincoln wins this election in 1860, and it's kind of weird because he only gets like 36% of the actual vote, of the popular vote, but he does win the Electoral College, which is all he needs to win the presidency. The South hated Lincoln so much because they disagreed with his views on his anti-slavery expansion policies. They wouldn't even let his name be on the ballots in the South. So literally not a single person in the South voted for him. So once he officially wins this election, because he got more votes than any of the Democrats, he is now, as in charge of the federal government, he is also in charge of the South, which is part of the federal government, part of the United States of America. So the South wants to expand slavery. Their argument is states are separate from the federal government. It's called federalism, big part of our Constitution. And that if a state decides they want to have slavery, then the federal government doesn't have the right to tell them they can't. This is starting to become the debate in society at the time. Some people are starting to say maybe a federal government can tell a state what to do. And the states in the South that support slavery, they're like, absolutely not. That is way too much power in a federal government. And they absolutely don't want that. So it wasn't an immediate leave. It wasn't like peace, we're out. There is one last ultimatum that gets attempted, and it's called the Crittenden Compromise. It's going to fail. But when Lincoln gets elected, the South is like, we're done with this because we know this dude's going to come in and try to, mess with the expansion of slavery. They show up, the southern states here, they're getting ready to leave, and they come up with this thing called the Crittenden Compromise, which says, all right, here's what we're going to do. All right, to end this for all, so it doesn't get out of hand, we're going to go back to the 3630 line. All right, the Missouri Compromise. We're going to put it back into place. Here's the rule, though: if you're above the 3630 line, you don't get to have slaves. Now, there's literally slave states above this that are basically the South is selling them out, being like, yeah, y'all got to get rid of your slaves. But everything below the 3630 line gets to be a slave state. Not only that, you can never talk about this again. It can never be discussed again, period. The 3630 line is the end-all, be-all in slavery, and slavery can never go away if this is passed. This is a very strong move by the South. It gets rejected in the Senate because the North is not going to go along with permanently allowing slavery to expand further west under the 3630 line. So when this happens, the South secedes. What that means is, here in this map, all the dark gray states here at the bottom of America, all right, that I'm kind of standing in the way of. Here, let me hop out of the way. All these areas, they become their own country. They just say, America, we're out. It's not like this. They call themselves the Confederate States of America. That's their country's names. They're not declaring war on America. They're just saying, peace, we're out. We'll still trade with you, but we're not going to be ruled by a guy who none of us voted for. All right? So the South is going to break off, call themselves the Confederate States of America. Their government, all right, is going to be very similar to the Articles of Confederation, which, if you remember from our first unit, gave all the power to the states. There's basically not a federal government, which is an important thing to point out here, because this is the dude they have picked to be their president of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis. All right, so Jefferson Davis is the president of the Confederacy. Now, every state that leaves the United States has to create their own state constitution. They all say slavery can stay. Like, slavery is a huge part of their constitution. So slavery is the 100% the catalyst for all this to happen. Jefferson Davis is their president. The thing is, since there's basically no federal government, Jefferson Davis doesn't really have any power. We'll talk about him. Really, because when the Civil War happens, we'll talk about Abraham Lincoln, who controls the military in the United States. And then his counterpart is Jefferson Davis in the South. But Jefferson Davis doesn't have nearly the power that Lincoln does. It's very important to understand why the South would create the Articles of Confederation style government, which failed after the United States got started. Because they are terrified of a strong central government. There is this states' rights versus federal government argument, and people like to say that the Civil War was over states' rights versus federal government. That ticked off a lot of people over the concept of slavery. That's what they were arguing about: who gets the final say-so in slavery, the state governments or the federal government. Without slavery, none of this happens. But the South is against having a federal government because, again, having a federal government, they got a president they didn't elect, all right, because they wouldn't let his name on the ballot. So the South is very anti-federal government. They create their own country called the Confederate States of America, in which all the states have to work together, and is very symbolic of the fact that they want no or very small federal government. So the question here is, what was the rationale for the Deep South to break off from and form their own country after 1860? Why is it symbolic of Southern frustration that they chose to create a government very similar to the Articles of Confederation? So we just got done talking about that. So pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. All right. So if you notice, the South just became their own country. There's no war here, all right? Lincoln gets sworn in, the South leaves. Lincoln's rut-row. Now, what's important to point out is not all the states that are slave owners that have slaves left the United States. Really, anybody South Carolina and below. So you can see here on this map, let me get out of the way, the 10 states that are outlined in kind of the brown highlighter, that's called the Deep South, all right? And the Deep South has seceded. The upper South, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, Virginia, they don't really know what to do right now. They're like, what? Like, they're slave-owning states. They identify a lot more with the southern, the states that just seceded, but this is really awkward. Like, they're like, we're just going to, it's like, your parents are fighting. You're like, I don't really want to pick a side. I'm just going to sit here and be quiet. And they're going to kind of see how this plays out before they really commit to one side or other. Well, there is an issue that is going to take place very quickly, all right, after the secession of the Deep South, that is going to have to force everybody to choose a side. And it's a situation with Fort Sumter. So South Carolina here in this map, South Carolina has a port that is incredibly important to the South, to the Confederate States of America, a port called Fort Sumter. Charleston, the city of Charleston is the port. There is a fort that defends that called Fort Sumter. All right. So Fort Sumter sits right in the harbor of Charleston to make sure nobody can go in and attack Charleston. Well, before secession, South Carolina was part of the United States of America. So the fort was built by taxpayer money, owned by the United States government, and stocked with United States troops to defend the United States at Charleston. Well, when the South secedes and the South becomes their own country, Fort Sumter here, and this is an actual picture, it's still there today. Fort Sumter, they still exist, but this is still a federal fort filled with federal troops, meaning troops that Abraham Lincoln controls. All right. So, but it is now an occupied territory since this state has left. So what happens is the South, they just roll on up to Fort Sumter, and they say, hey, guys there in Fort Sumter, I know you guys are federal troops, which means they work for the United States, which, keep in mind, the United States didn't disappear. The United States still exist. They're just like, go home to the United States. This is now Confederate States of America property. Well, the soldiers that are stationed here respond with, no. This was a fort built by United States taxpayer money. We own it. We're not leaving. Bye. And they just locked the door. All right. And the South is like, oh, crap. How are we going to deal with this? And Lincoln, he's been in office for like a day. He's like, holy crap. Like, how is this going to play out? All right. So the question here is explain the tense situation that involves here at Fort Sumter, and how both sides feel they have a right to it. So the South, it's in the South's territory now. So the South thinks they should own this fort. The North is like, no, we built it. We own it. You can't just claim it. This is American military property. So pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. So there's some strategery going to take place here on the part of Lincoln. Lincoln, he has to play chess from the time he gets started here. We're going to talk a ton with Lincoln. Lincoln knows. So let me back up. When Lincoln is sworn in as president, the president puts their hand on the Bible, or whatever they choose to put their hand on. They're not required of the Bible, but Lincoln put his on the Bible. And he swears to protect the Union at all costs, meaning America. Well, when he becomes president and half the country leaves, he feels, since his oath is to protect the Union, meaning the United States, they're not allowed to leave. It is his responsibility to go get the South back. Well, the South, they just dipped out. How's he going to get them back? The only real way of doing this is if you go to war with them. Now, a lot of people in the North, when the South leaves, they're like, good. Whew, that problem solved. We'll just be your own country. They'll be their own country. And Lincoln's the only one that's like, nah, we're not going to do that. We're going to hug this out as a family. So Lincoln needs to go to war with the South to force them to come back in. However, he would never have the support by the people to just invade the South and attack the South, because that makes you look like the bad guy. And Lincoln, already half the country hates him so much they left. And so Lincoln doesn't, he has to be very delicate here. He can't just invade the South. So what he has to do is he has to make the South look like the bad guy and get the South to attack the United States. Well, why in the world would the South do that? That would be stupid. What would possibly make them do that? So Lincoln, kind of like in the Mexican-American War we talked about, how America likes to poke people with a stick to get them to attack us, so therefore they're the bad guy. Lincoln's going to do the same thing here at Fort Sumter. So Fort Sumter is surrounded by Confederate troops, and they're just going to wait it out because they're not trying to be aggressive here and start a war because the South doesn't want it. They just want to break up and leave. So the South is sitting here and they're like, all right, these guys got about 3 days of food left. We'll just wait them out. When they get real hungry, they'll leave. All right, and then we'll take over the fort. So Lincoln knows this is what the South's plan is. So what Lincoln does in the middle of the night is he sneaks in a boat in the middle of the night and resupplies Fort Sumter for like 3 more weeks. The next morning, when the Confederate soldiers realize that Fort Sumter has been resupplied the last 3 weeks, the South claims that is an act of aggression because Lincoln is actively trying to remain in Southern territory with an invading army, even though they were there when the country changed. And that's the South's rationale for opening fire on Fort Sumter. When the South opens fire on Fort Sumter, this was the reaction Lincoln needed. He poked him with a stick by resupplying him with food. When the South opens fire on Fort Sumter, who's the first one to fire a shot in this war? The South is on United States troops, and because of that, the South is the aggressor, and Abraham Lincoln is able to turn around and declare war on the Confederate States of America, hoping to be able to force them to join the United States again. When Lincoln declares war on the United States, it's decision time for a lot of states. So like North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, Virginia, these upper South states, they're like, nah, we're not, like, we got to stick with the other slave states. And the upper South is going to join the Confederacy here. And like the battle lines literally and figuratively are drawn and everybody has to pick a side. Very important here because it plays a big role in the politics that are going to happen here during this war. If you were a free state, you were part of the United States the whole time. You didn't leave and join the Confederacy. The Confederacy didn't have any free states in it. But there were a handful of slave states that stayed part of the United States of America, like Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware. These are slave states that decided not to leave with the South. One of them didn't really have a choice. They're kind of forced to stay, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But the question here is, why was it so important for Lincoln not to appear to be the aggressor at Fort Sumter? How could it have hurt his cause if he were to immediately declare war on the Confederate States of America? Keep in mind, Lincoln isn't like super popular. If he's the aggressor and he basically declares war on these innocent Southerners, he's going to have zero support for this war in the North, and it probably isn't even going to happen. So Lincoln has to make this war appear to be started by the South, which he's able to do by resupplying Fort Sumter. So pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. All right, so let's talk. What is a civil war? A civil war is just when a country goes to war with itself. Most countries have had a civil war at some point. The United States just happens to happen between 1860 and 1865. 1861 and 1865. The same amount of people that died in the Civil War is equal to every other war America has ever fought combined. It is absolutely catastrophic, the amount of people that died in the Civil War. I got a graph here to show you. So 620,000 people when this graphic was made, even when I typed this up, which wasn't that long ago, the guesstimate was 620,000. Modern, since about 2013, like that's how modern the new projections are, it is over 700,000 people died in the Civil War. Like, the number catastrophically keeps going up. So many people died. It's one of the very few wars that actually it's the only war we don't have an exact number of, because everybody was so busy murdering each other, they didn't have time to really keep count of who all was dying. So you can see all these other wars that are listed here have very specific numbers. The Civil War, it was so catastrophic, once we get started here, that accurate numbers were not effectively kept. So there was one specific situation that you need to be aware of. So back in the day, when civil wars happened, war was a lot simpler. It was more like capture the flag. If one side takes over the other side's capital, you win. The capital for the United States of America is Washington, D.C., which is right on the border of Virginia and Maryland. It's not actually in a state. It's literally on the border of Virginia and Maryland. You can see it here on the map if you look closely. That it's on the border of Virginia and Maryland. So the South, they have to create their own capital. Instead of putting it in the deep South, they actually put it in Richmond, Virginia, which seems kind of silly to make your capital 90 miles away from the other side's capital, since it's basically capture the flag. Why would you put their flag so close to the other side's, flag? Because if you take over the other side's capital, you'll win the war. All right? Well, all the troops, all the supplies, everything takes place at your capital, so actually invading a capital would be incredibly difficult. But the reason the South puts their capital, they could have chosen anywhere they wanted in the South to make it so close to the North and the North's capital, is when this war is going to happen, you have to walk everywhere, all right? Because all the train tracks that would connect the two sides are blown up immediately. 90 miles is a long way to walk. It's not like present day where you have airplanes and helicopters and stuff. So 90 miles is still a long way if you're walking, which is how you would have gotten around in the 1860s to go fight this war. If you put it in the deep South and the North comes down to try to take over your capital, say you put it in Mississippi, there's nobody to defend Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, as the North comes in, and they would just be losing these states one after another. So that's why the South chooses to put the capital right next to the United States to defend the South from an invading United States military. One very specific situation happens, and it's called martial law. No president has ever done this other than Lincoln. And it actually makes Lincoln pretty unpopular. All right. So Lincoln, while today 16th president, probably the greatest president we've ever had, him or George Washington, take your pick. Abraham Lincoln is not a very liked president. Not only does half the country leave because they hate him so much when he shows up, he puts Maryland under martial law. So, like Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Delaware, these states are slave states that choose to remain part of the United States of America. They get to keep their slaves. Nothing has changed. No rules have changed here. All right? The United States is the United States. Maryland didn't get the chance to make their decision. Lincoln rolls in and shuts down Maryland. He puts it under martial law, which means they can't have a meeting, they can't talk, they can't discuss, they can't do anything at all during this war, because Lincoln has shut down their state government. He put the entire state under military control, took away all their rights, all their constitutional rights. He says, you don't have them anymore. I'm in control of this state. Why? Why would Lincoln, and this is extreme, and so a lot of people in the North that liked Lincoln are like, whoa, you're just taking away people's rights? Maybe you are this tyrant that the South says you are. The reason Lincoln cannot let Maryland decide whether they want to stay or go themselves is because Washington, D.C., the capital, remember it's they capture the flag, is on the border of Virginia, who has already left and joined the Confederacy, and Maryland. If Maryland also secedes, Washington, D.C. is in the middle of occupied territory, and the war's over, the United States loses, and that's it. Lincoln cannot let Maryland secede, or Washington, D.C. will collapse, since it would then be surrounded. So Maryland gets put under martial law and gets put on complete military lockdown during the Civil War, so that this slave state doesn't have the option of leaving during the Civil War. And again, when you take away everybody's rights, and put the military and keep people from having meetings and have any type of local government, you lose a lot of support. So Lincoln, from the time he takes over, is not a very popular president at the start of his time in office. So the question here is, why did Lincoln have to put Maryland under martial law? And what was so significant about that one specific state at this time? So pause me, answer that completely, And we're moving on. All right. Lincoln's got one goal when he's in office. One goal and one goal only. Bring the South back. It's a stressful goal. Wait a minute, Mr. Wagstaff. Didn't Abraham Lincoln free all the slaves? Yeah, he will. And he does it in 1865. We're in 1861. Abraham Lincoln changes a lot as a person from 1861 to 1865. You want to see how much Abraham Lincoln is going to change as a person from 1861 to 1865? That's 5 years of stress. That is why presidents always age a whole lot because it's a very stressful job. Let me get out of the way here so you can see this. That is a wildly, it's the most extreme example of this, of the level of stress that Abraham Lincoln is under. Abraham Lincoln's number one goal in the entire war, bring the South back in. When he's done being president, the dang country better be one country again. When he got elected, it was one country. When he leaves, however that is, he ends up getting shot. Spoiler alert. But he was like, when I'm done being the president, it needs to be one country again. That is his only goal. He says this all the time. Now, he knows that the reason they split up was slavery, and he does not want slavery to expand. But Lincoln, literally at this point, doesn't even think the federal government has the authority to tell the states that they couldn't have slaves, even if he wanted to. His views on that will change throughout the war. But at the time, his only thing was not to let slavery expand. It wasn't to go to Alabama and tell Alabama they couldn't have slaves. Like, that would be crazy talk in his mind at the time. So Lincoln's only goal in the entire war is to bring these parts back together. And he says multiple times, if I can bring the South back in and I can free all the slaves, great. If I can bring the South back in and free some slaves and not others, great. If I can bring the South back in and not free any slaves, great. All right. Lincoln was clear. His only goal, bring the South back into the United States. That was it. All right. That is his number one and only goal at the start. We associate him with ending slavery, and he is 100% responsible for that. Don't know if it happens if we had any other president. And we're going to talk about that in depth as we progress through there. But understand, that was not his priority. That actually ended up being something at the very end of the war. We'll talk about it a few lessons from now. When it's obvious that North is getting ready to win, he's like, ooh, one last thing. And that's when 13th Amendment just, no more slavery. But it was at the very end of the war when the war was already done and settled. But that is not his mentality at the start. It is to bring the South back in because he didn't want to be the guy that was responsible for the South and the North splitting apart. So the question here is, what was Lincoln's only goal at the start of the Civil War, and why is slavery not his top priority at the start of the conflict? So pause me, answer that completely, but we're pretty much done. So I will see you guys tomorrow.